Out on the Texas plains where the sky is so big it can swallow a man whole, Caleb Weston was already gone. He just hadn't stopped breathing yet. His world had shrunk to a patch of dirt and a cabin that sagged like an old man's shoulders. The wind was his only neighbor, and it mostly whispered things he didn't want to hear. Inside, the air was thick with ghosts. The ghost of his wife, Martha. The ghost of his boy, Thomas. Taken by the fever 2 winters back, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than a gravestone. In the corner, a little rocking horse sat covered in dust, a monument to a future that had turned to ash in his hands. Caleb's life was a circle of chores. Check the traps, mend the fence, stare at the horizon. He was a shell of a man, hollowed out by grief, just waiting for the world to finish the job. He wasn't living. He was just waiting. And then one day, under a sun that baked the world the color of bone, the circle broke. He was down by the creek, a muddy snake winding through his land, looking for tracks. Anything for the pot. That's when he saw it, a splash of color against the brown earth, a smear of deep, angry red. His first thought was a wounded animal, but as he got closer, his hand finding the worn leather grip of his pistol, the shape became something else. It was a woman. She was face down in the shallow water, her dark hair spreading out like a spill of ink. Her dress, made of soft buckskin and covered in beadwork he'd never seen before, was torn, and it was stained, not just with mud, with blood, a lot of it, a nasty gash on her side, the flesh around it angry and swollen. She was Comanche, maybe Kiowa. To the folks back east, that meant one thing: trouble. Every warning bell he had, honed by years on the frontier, screamed at him. Walk away, pretend you saw nothing. This is not your fight. Leaving her was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. He stood there, the wind hissing through the reeds, and he almost did it. He almost turned his back. But then he saw her hand, the delicate way her fingers were curled. He remembered holding Martha's hand as her life slipped away, helpless. He remembered lifting Thomas onto his shoulders to see the endless sky. He couldn't save his own family. He cursed himself. He cursed the land. He cursed God. And then, with a grunt that felt like it tore something loose inside his soul, Caleb knelt. He gathered the woman into his arms. She was so light. As he lifted her, a tiny moan escaped her lips. It was the first sign of real, breathing life he'd paid any mind to in 2 long years. He had just picked up the biggest complication in all of Texas. And as he carried her back to his cabin, he had a sinking feeling that he wasn't just carrying a wounded woman. He was carrying his own damn reckoning. He laid her on his cot, the only soft place in his whole miserable existence. For a long moment, he just stared. A native woman, bleeding and unconscious, in his bed. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty anymore. It was buzzing. It was alive with danger. He let out a long sigh and got to work. He tore strips from one of Martha's old sheets, an act that felt like a sacrilege, a sharp pain twisting in his gut. His hands, steady enough for skinning a rabbit, felt clumsy as he cleaned the wound. It wasn't a clean cut from a knife, and it wasn't a puncture from an arrow. This was different. It was jagged, brutal. But underneath the blood, he saw something that made his skin crawl. The edges of the wound, they were seared, cauterized, as if someone had pressed a hot piece of metal into her side. And around it, almost hidden, was the faint outline of a symbol, a shape he didn't recognize. This wasn't a wound from a fight. This was a message, a branding. What in God's name had this woman gotten herself into? For 3 days, she was lost in a fever dream. Caleb sat by her side, a silent guardian. He trickled water between her lips and changed the strange dressing he'd made from yarrow and boiled linen. He watched her face. It was strong, with high cheekbones and a jaw that spoke of defiance, even when she was unconscious. He found himself studying the beads on her dress, the intricate patterns. They told a story he couldn't read. He was tending to an enemy, by all accounts, a stranger who would probably try to kill him if she woke up. But a strange sense of duty had settled on him, heavy and unwelcome. He wasn't just trying to save her. He was trying to understand that symbol burned into her skin. On the 4th morning, he woke up to find her eyes wide open. They were dark, bottomless pits, and they were locked right on him. There was no fear in them, just a sharp, cold intelligence. She was sizing him up. He froze, his tin cup of coffee halfway to his mouth. The silence in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. He slowly lowered the cup. He raised an open hand, the universal sign for, "I'm not going to kill you." Her eyes didn't soften. They flickered to his rifle by the door, then back to him. She tried to sit up, but a sharp gasp of pain shot through her, and she fell back. Her jaw clenched, but she didn't make another sound. Caleb moved slowly, deliberately. He ladled some thin rabbit broth into a bowl and approached the cot like he was walking up on a cornered wolf. He held out the bowl. She stared at it, then at him. Her eyes narrowed into slits. He just stood there, offering, waiting. Finally, her gaze dropped to the bowl. She reached out a hesitant hand and took it. Her fingers brushed his, and it was like a jolt of lightning in the dead air of the cabin. She drank, her eyes never leaving his face. It was the beginning of their strange, silent life together. They had no words they could share. Their whole world was gestures. A nod from him toward the water bucket. A slight dip of her chin to accept a piece of bread. He'd go about his chores and he could feel her eyes on him, following every move. When she got strong enough, she'd sit by the fire, her back ramrod straight, working on repairing the beadwork on a small leather pouch. The patient, rhythmic work of her needle was a quiet act of rebellion, a way of saying, "You can't break me." Caleb started watching her, too, the way she moved with a quiet grace that grew as her strength returned. He started to see the little things, the way her lips would tighten when a coyote howled too close, the faraway look in her eyes as she stared into the flames of the fire. He started to see a person, not a Comanche, not an enemy, a woman as lost and alone as he was. But the question of the brand on her side hung between them, a silent, terrifying secret. He had no way to ask, and even if he could, he was certain she wouldn't answer. One night, a storm blew in, a real Texas tantrum of thunder and lightning that shook the cabin to its bones. Caleb was securing the shutters when a crack of thunder boomed so loud it made him jump. He let out a little, involuntary yelp. When he turned, she was watching him, and for the first time, there wasn't suspicion in her eyes. It was something else, something that looked like understanding. He felt a hot flush of embarrassment and turned back to the fire. Later that night, the storm still raging, he found himself standing in the corner, his hand resting on the dusty rocking horse. The grief, always hiding just below the surface, jumped out and ambushed him. His shoulders started to shake. He didn't even realize he was crying until he felt a light touch on his arm. He spun around. She was standing there, her face softened by the firelight, her eyes holding a deep, ancient sadness. She looked from his face to the little wooden horse, and then back to him. And in her eyes he saw that she understood everything. She saw the ghosts. She saw the hollow space in his heart. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. In that one silent moment, she had looked right through him and seen the broken pieces of the man he used to be. The silence between them changed after that night. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full. It was a shared space. He started leaving wildflowers for her on the rough wooden table, little splashes of purple and orange he'd find on his walks. He didn't know why. It just felt right, and she in return began to teach him. She would point at the water bucket. "Pa!" He'd repeat it, his voice a clumsy growl. "Pa!" She would give a tiny approving nod. Fire was kutsu, rabbit was tavo. Each word was a single thread, weaving a fragile bridge between their two worlds. He learned her name was Winona. As she healed, she started helping with chores. She showed him how to set snares that actually worked, how to read the signs on the land he'd been blind to for years. He showed her the hand-cranked corn grinder, a piece of machinery that fascinated her. Sometimes a small smile would pass between them. Laughter was still a long way off, but something was starting to thaw inside Caleb's frozen heart. He'd taken her in to save her, but he was slowly starting to realize she was saving him right back. But there was a dark side to their new language. One afternoon he found her staring at the brand on his cattle, a simple CW. Her face was pale. She pointed to the hot iron he used. Then she pointed to the scar on her own side. Kutsu, she whispered, her voice trembling. Fire. He understood then. The brand on her side had been deliberate, painful, a punishment. He felt a surge of rage so powerful, it almost knocked him over. Who would do that to another human being? Before he could think, he grabbed the branding iron and, with a roar of fury, hurled it as far as he could out the cabin door, into the dust. Winona watched him, her eyes wide, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of trust. He had declared, without a single word, whose side he was on. He was on hers, but he still didn't know what that meant, or who they were up against. The peace they had built, word by word, gesture by gesture, was about to be burned to the ground. It happened on a blistering hot afternoon. 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking his cabin, black shapes against a blinding blue sky. They weren't cowboys. They rode with the lazy, confident slump of men who were used to taking whatever they wanted. Caleb's blood went cold. He knew the man in the lead. Garrett Donovan, a vulture in a man's skin. Donovan and his crew of ex-militia thugs preyed on the edges of the territory, picking the bones of anyone weaker than them. And Caleb had a history with him, a dark one. It was Donovan's snake oil that Martha had taken in her final days, a useless, expensive tonic he'd sold as a miracle cure. Caleb had run him out of town then, but he'd never forgotten that cold, dead-eyed smile. Inside, Caleb said to Winona, the words sharp as a razor, "Don't make a sound." She saw the look on his face and vanished into the shadows of the cabin. Caleb stepped onto the porch, his hand resting casually but firmly on the butt of his pistol. Donovan's crew rode down, kicking up dust, their eyes sweeping over his poor excuse for a home with open contempt. "Weston," Donovan sneered, a greasy smile on his face. "Still hiding out here with the ghosts?" "Donovan," Caleb said, his voice flat as a tombstone. "What do you want?" "Just passing through," Donovan said, but his eyes were locked on the cabin door. "Heard there was a skirmish out this way a few weeks back. We were tracking some Comanche renegades. Lost one of them. A woman." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You ain't seen a stray, have you? Wounded, maybe?" Caleb's heart was pounding a drum against his ribs, but his face was stone. "Haven't seen anyone, just me." Donovan grunted, not believing a word. One of his men, a greasy-looking man with a missing tooth, pointed a dirty finger. "What's that, boss?" Caleb looked. A small strip of the linen bandage he'd used on Winona had caught on a nail by the rain barrel. It was fluttering in the breeze. A tiny white flag of surrender. It was nothing. It was everything. In the tense silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. "That's my business," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. Donovan's smile got wider. It was the smile of a predator that had just cornered its prey. "Is that so? We heard this particular stray was important, that her daddy is some big chief, important enough for a handsome reward." He looked Caleb up and down. "A man living like this could surely use a reward, Weston." "I told you," Caleb repeated, his voice like flint striking steel. "There's no one here." Donovan just stared, the air crackling with menace. Caleb didn't move a muscle. He wasn't the same hollow man from a few weeks ago. Now he had something to protect. "All right, Weston," Donovan finally said with a shrug. "Have it your way." He turned his horse. "But we ain't going far, and if we find out you're lying—" He paused, looking back at the cabin. "This little shack of yours burns real easy." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a promise of violence hanging in the air. Caleb went back inside. Winona stepped out of the shadows, her face a grim mask. She had heard it all. Her eyes met his. In that moment, they weren't a settler and a Comanche. They were allies. They were partners. The world he had tried so desperately to shut out hadn't just come knocking. It had come to burn everything down. And as Caleb looked at Winona, he realized the truth. Donovan wasn't here for a bounty. He was here to finish a job. The same job someone else had started with a hot piece of iron. The next day was a lifetime. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every bird call sounded like a warning. Caleb and Winona moved in a new kind of silence, a silence of preparation. He cleaned his rifle, his movements sharp and precise. She found an old hunting bow he'd forgotten in the barn. She tested the string, her fingers moving with a familiar, deadly grace. She started sharpening arrowheads on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape was the only sound in the cabin. Watching her, so focused, so lethal, stirred something fierce in Caleb. He had taken her in out of some fading memory of decency. Now the thought of letting them harm her was unthinkable. She wasn't just a person he was protecting. She was the reason he was a person again. She had pulled him back from the edge of nothingness. He wasn't just defending her anymore. He was defending the last spark of hope in his own soul. They knew Donovan would be back. It was just a question of when. As the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in angry streaks of orange and purple, he saw them. On the ridge. This time they weren't trying to be quiet. They fanned out, riding down toward the cabin. Their intentions were crystal clear. "Stay away from the window," Caleb ordered. He took his position by the door, the heavy rifle feeling like an extension of his own arm. This little cabin, once a tomb for his memories, was now a fortress. "Caleb," Winona said. Her voice was soft, but hard as iron. He turned. She held the bow, an arrow already nocked. Her eyes were blazing with a fire that could have lit up the dusk. She pointed toward the back window, which gave a clear shot to the side of the cabin. It was a question. It was a promise. He gave her a single, sharp nod. They were in this together. To the end. The pounding on the door was heavy enough to shake the walls. "Weston, we know she's in there. Send her out, and we'll let you live." Donovan's voice was a drunken, furious roar. Caleb didn't answer. His knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. He wasn't giving her up. Let the world burn. A heavy boot slammed into the door. Crack. Wood splintered. Another slam. Crash. The door flew open and one of Donovan's men lunged in, pistol raised. Caleb didn't think. He just acted. The rifle roared, the sound deafening in the tiny cabin. The man crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. And then all hell broke loose. Gunfire exploded from outside. A bullet tore through the wall right next to Caleb's head, showering him with splinters. He fired back through the open doorway, driving the others to cover. He could hear Donovan screaming orders, his voice raw with rage. Suddenly, a choked scream came from outside, off to the right. Caleb risked a glance. One of Donovan's men was on the ground, clutching his leg. An arrow was sticking out of his thigh. Winona, from the back window. Donovan, seeing his man go down, lost his mind. He charged the doorway, firing his pistol wildly. Bang! 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 Bullets chewed up the wall behind Caleb. He was pinned down. He could see Donovan reloading, getting ready for another rush. It was over. He was out of time. He had maybe one shot left. Then a blur of motion inside the cabin. Winona wasn't at the window anymore. She had moved like a shadow. In her hand was the heavy skinning knife from Caleb's belt. As Donovan stepped through the doorway, his eyes locked on Caleb, ready to deliver the final shot. Winona exploded from the shadows. She wasn't a wounded victim. She was a warrior. Her face was a mask of pure, cold fury. She drove the knife up under Donovan's arm, a powerful, brutal thrust into the soft spot beneath his ribs. Donovan roared, a sound of complete shock and agony. His pistol went off, the bullet burying itself in the floor. He staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief as he looked at Winona. He tried to raise his gun again, but his strength was gone. He collapsed in the doorway, a look of stunned surprise on his face, and then he was still. The last man standing, the one who wasn't shot or full of arrows, saw his leader fall. He lost his nerve. He fired one last wild shot into the night, then scrambled onto his horse and galloped away into the darkness. Silence fell, heavy, absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the pathetic moans of the man with the arrow in his leg. The cabin was a disaster zone. The air stank of gunpowder and blood. Caleb looked at Winona. She was standing over Donovan's body, the bloody knife still clutched in her hand, her chest heaving. Her eyes met his across the ruined room. The quiet bond they had built with gestures and kindness had just been forged anew in violence and fire. He had stood to protect her, and in the end, she had saved him. He crossed the room and gently took the knife from her trembling hand. His fingers closed over hers. In the dim, bloody light of the cabin, he saw the brand on her side again, and then looked at the dead man at her feet, and a terrible new thought began to form in his mind. What if Donovan hadn't been the one who branded her? What if he was just a hired gun? And if he was, who hired him? Who wanted this woman dead so badly they'd mark her like an animal first? The fight was over, but Caleb had a chilling feeling the war had just begun. They worked through the night, a grim, silent team. Caleb tied up the wounded man, and at dawn he put him on a horse and sent him packing with a simple message: "Don't come back." They dragged the bodies of Donovan and his other man far from the cabin and buried them in shallow, unmarked graves. There were no prayers said. Back at the cabin, they started to put their world back together. He mended the shattered door. She scrubbed the blood from the floorboards. When it was all done, they sat by the fire. The silence wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a conversation. He looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, the courage that burned beneath her calm exterior. He reached out and gently touched the scar on her side, the scar he had tended, the scar that started all of this. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. The words felt small, hopelessly inadequate for what he was feeling. She looked at him, and for the first time she gave him a real smile. It lit up her whole face. It was like seeing the sun rise after a long, dark night. She placed her hand over his. "Caleb," she said. His name on her tongue was a melody. That one word was enough. In that moment, the ghosts in the cabin seemed to finally fade away. The little home didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like a beginning. But their newfound peace was short-lived. A week later, another group of riders appeared on the horizon. But these weren't like Donovan's men. There were at least 20 of them, and they rode with a proud, disciplined grace. They were Comanche, their faces painted, their lances decorated with eagle feathers. They rode like they owned the land because they once had. Caleb's hand instinctively went to his pistol, but Winona placed a calming hand on his arm. "My people," she said, her voice soft. They watched as the war party stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. One man, older than the rest, with a face like a weathered cliffside, dismounted and walked toward them. He was magnificent, a chief in every sense of the word. Winona stepped out to meet him. Caleb followed a few paces behind. She spoke to the man in their native tongue, her voice clear and strong. She spoke for a long time, pointing to the cabin, to Caleb, and to the scar on her side. The old chief listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When she finished, his eyes, sharp and intelligent, landed on Caleb. It was a look that seemed to peer right into his soul, weighing and measuring him. Caleb stood his ground. He had nothing to hide. The chief spoke to Winona, his voice a low rumble. She turned to Caleb. "This is my father, Washaki. He is the great war chief of the Nokoni band." She took a deep breath. "I have told him everything, that you found me when I was left for dead, that you tended my wound, that you fought for me against the men who attacked my escort." The chief, Washaki, took a step forward. He spoke in broken, heavily accented English. "You save my daughter." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But you do not know the whole story." Caleb felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. "The men who attacked her," Washaki continued, his voice like gravel. "The men who branded her, they were not white men. They were Comanche." The world seemed to tilt under Caleb's feet. He looked at Winona. Her eyes were filled with a deep sadness. She had kept the darkest secret of all. She hadn't been attacked by outsiders. She had been betrayed by her own people. "My brother," Washaki said, his voice filled with a cold, hard rage. "My own blood. He wants to be chief. He thinks I am too friendly to the white man. He thinks we should drive you all back into the sea." He looked from Caleb to the cabin and back again. "He made a deal with the man you killed, Donovan, to have my daughter taken, to start a war." Caleb finally understood. Winona wasn't just a chief's daughter. She was a political target, a pawn in a brutal game for power within her own tribe. The brand wasn't just a punishment. It was a sign of a traitor, meant to shame her and her father. Washaki raised a hand. One of his warriors led 2 magnificent horses forward. "A gift," the chief said, "for the life of my daughter, and for killing the snake, Donovan." Caleb looked at the horses, then at Winona. Her people were here. It was time for her to go. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The small, fragile world they had built was about to be torn apart. "I must go, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is my fight now." He could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. He had just found his way back to life, and now life was leaving. "I understand," he finally choked out. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden bird. He'd been whittling it in the evenings. He pressed it into her hand. "So you remember." Tears welled in her eyes. She clutched the bird. From around her neck, she removed the small beaded pouch she had so carefully repaired. "And you," she said, her voice breaking as she pressed it into his hand. "So you do not forget." She turned and walked to her father, mounting one of the horses. She looked back at him one last time. Her gaze held everything they had been through. The terror, the quiet moments, the fight for their lives. It was a silent goodbye that screamed 1,000 words. Caleb Weston stood on the porch of his small cabin and watched her ride away, a proud, straight figure disappearing into the vastness of the plains. He watched until she was just a speck, and then nothing at all. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the echo of her presence. He opened his hand and looked at the beaded pouch. He could feel something hard inside, not just beads. He carefully opened the drawstring. Inside, nestled among some dried herbs, was a single heavy lead bullet, a rifle round. But this one was different. Scratched into the soft lead was a symbol, the same symbol that had been burned into Winona's side. His blood ran cold. This wasn't a goodbye gift. It was a warning and a request. Washaki's brother had tried to start a war by using white men to capture Winona. He had failed. Now what would he do? He would need a new plan, a new way to ignite the flames of hatred. And Caleb, the lone white man who had helped the chief's daughter, who had killed the hired guns. He was the perfect target. They hadn't just left him behind. They had left him as bait. He looked out at the horizon, at the empty plains where she had disappeared. He was alone again, in his cabin on the edge of nowhere. But he wasn't a ghost anymore. He had something to fight for, and he had a feeling the fight was coming right back to his front door. He clutched the pouch in his hand, the marked bullet feeling heavy with the weight of the future. The wind picked up, howling across the plains, and it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like war drums. For a month the plains were quiet, too quiet. Caleb moved through his days with a new purpose. He reinforced the cabin door. He stockpiled ammunition. He spent hours on the ridge, scanning the horizon, the beaded pouch always tucked in his shirt, the marked bullet a cold reminder against his skin. He wasn't just waiting for an attack. He was preparing for one. He studied the land around his cabin, not as a homesteader, but as a soldier. He noted the dry gullies that offered hidden approaches, the clusters of rock that could provide cover for a rifleman. He set tripwires connected to stacks of empty tin cans, 100 yards out in every direction. His little homestead was no longer a home. It was a kill box. During the long, quiet nights, he would take out the little wooden bird he had almost given her, running his thumb over the smooth wood. He had slipped it back into his own pocket at the last second. He didn't know why. It just didn't feel like their story was over. One evening, as twilight settled, one of the tripwires rattled. Caleb grabbed his rifle and flattened himself against the wall beside a window, his heart hammering. He peered through a crack in the wood. It wasn't a war party. It was a single rider leading a weary horse. As the figure got closer, he realized it was a woman. It was Winona. He threw the door open. She practically fell into his arms, exhausted and dust-covered. Her horse looked half dead. "What happened?" he asked, his voice rough. "He knows," she panted, her eyes wide with fear. "My uncle, Tavik. One of Donovan's men survived. The one you sent away. He went back. Not to his own people. He went to Tavik. He told him everything. About you. About this place." Caleb's stomach dropped. The loose end he had let go had come back like a noose. "My father sent warriors to hunt Tavik down," she continued. "But he is clever. He moves like a snake. He gathered his own warriors, men who hate my father's peace. They are coming. Not just for me. They are coming to burn this place to the ground and leave your body as a message. To prove my father's trust in the white man is a weakness. How many? Caleb asked, his mind already racing. Too many, she whispered. 15, maybe more. Two of them against 15. The odds were impossible. They were suicidal. You shouldn't have come back, he said, his voice softer than he intended. You didn't think I would leave you to face them alone, did you? She replied, a faint, weary smile on her face. We are in this together. She pressed something into his hand. It was a beautiful, deadly-looking Comanche bow, much finer than the one in his barn, and a quiver full of iron-tipped arrows. My father sends his strength. So the old chief knew. He knew his daughter had ridden back here, into the heart of the danger. He hadn't sent his army with her. He had sent a bow. It wasn't an insult. It was a sign of respect, a declaration that this was their fight to win or lose. They had maybe a day, two at most. They worked without sleeping. Winona showed Caleb how to dig deep pits along the main trail to the cabin, covering them with brittle branches and dust. They weren't meant to kill, just to break a horse's leg and throw the enemy into chaos. He showed her the best firing positions, the lines of sight from the cabin windows and the roof. As they worked, a new kind of intimacy grew between them. They talked. She told him about her uncle, how he saw their traditions dying, replaced by the white man's world, how his hatred was born from a place of fear. He told her about Martha and Thomas. He spoke their names out loud for the first time in 2 years. He even took her to their small, simple graves behind the cabin. She knelt and placed a wildflower on each mound of dirt. When she stood up, she took his hand. They are not ghosts, Caleb, she said softly. They are your ancestors. They give you strength. In that moment, standing by the graves of his past, holding the hand of his present, Caleb felt a profound shift inside him. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for a future he hadn't dared to even imagine. The attack came at dawn on the second day. They appeared on the ridge, just as Donovan had. But this was no band of thugs. They were warriors, painted for battle, their war cries echoing across the plains. Caleb and Winona were in position, him in the cabin, her hidden in a cluster of rocks 50 yards away, giving them a deadly crossfire. The first wave of riders charged forward. Just as they planned, 2 of them galloped straight into the pits. Horses screamed. Men shouted in confusion. The charge faltered. And in that moment of chaos, Caleb and Winona opened fire. Caleb's rifle boomed, knocking one warrior from his saddle. A heartbeat later, an arrow sprouted from another man's chest. The warriors scrambled for cover, returning fire, bullets and arrows thudding into the cabin walls and chipping stone from the rocks where Winona was hidden. The battle raged for hours. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of surprise and defensive positions. Caleb's planning and Winona's skill were a perfect, lethal combination. They fought back to back, a 2-person army against a small horde. By midday, 5 of Tavek's warriors were down. But they were running low on ammunition, and the enemy was adapting, starting a slow, careful flanking maneuver. Suddenly, Caleb saw a flicker of movement from the barn. Tavek himself, using the chaos as cover, had slipped past their defenses, and he wasn't heading for the cabin. He was heading for the rocks where Winona was hiding. "Winona, behind you!" Caleb roared. He fired his rifle at Tavek, but the shot was rushed and went wide. Winona spun around just as her uncle leaped over the rocks, a long knife in his hand. Caleb watched in horror as they engaged in a brutal, desperate fight. He was too far away to help. He felt that old, familiar helplessness wash over him, the same feeling he'd had watching his family die. No, not again. He didn't think. He just ran. He burst out of the cabin door, firing his pistol as he sprinted toward the rocks, drawing the fire of the other warriors. A bullet grazed his arm, spinning him around, but he kept going. He had to get to her. He saw Tavek knock the bow from Winona's hands. He saw the flash of Tavek's knife, but then he saw Winona move with lightning speed. She dropped and swept Tavek's legs out from under him. As he fell, she drew her own knife, the skinning knife Caleb had given her, the one she had used on Donovan, and plunged it into his chest. The remaining warriors, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. Their fight was with Tavek, their loyalty to him, With him gone, their purpose vanished. A moment later, they turned and fled. Silence fell on the blood-soaked battlefield. Caleb ran to Winona. She was breathing heavily, her face bruised, but she was alive. She was safe. He pulled her into his arms, and this time, he didn't let go. He had faced down the ghosts of his past. He had run toward the danger instead of watching helplessly. He was whole again. They buried the dead, a grim and exhausting task. As they stood over Tavik's grave, Winona looked at Caleb. "It is over," she said. "Is it?" he asked. "Your tribe is still divided. My being here, it will always be a problem." "Then we will find a new place," she said, her voice firm. "Together." The word hung in the air between them. Together. It was a promise that felt more real, more solid than the cabin, than the land, than anything he had ever known. A week later they were packing. They were leaving the cabin and its ghosts behind. They planned to head north, to the mountains, to find a place where they could build a new life, far from the politics of her people and the judgment of his. As Caleb was loading the last of his supplies onto one of the horses Washaki had given him, he saw a lone rider approaching. It was Washaki. The great chief rode up and dismounted. He looked at the packed horses, at Caleb, and at his daughter. His face was impossible to read. "You have killed my brother," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "He gave us no choice," Caleb said, standing his ground. "He disgraced our family," Winona added. "He fought with no honor." Washaki nodded slowly. "His warriors have returned. They told the council what happened. How Tavik made a deal with the white man, Donovan. How he attacked his own kin. How you," he said, looking at Caleb, "fought with the heart of a Comanche warrior to protect my daughter." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the plains. "Our laws are old. Blood must be answered with blood. Tavik's betrayal has been answered by his death. The balance is restored." He then looked directly at Caleb, his eyes seeming to pierce right through him. "But a new debt has been created. The life of a chief's daughter, saved not once but twice. This is a powerful debt. It cannot be paid with horses." Caleb's hand instinctively went to his pistol. Was this it? Was the chief here to demand a final price? "I have come to make you an offer," Washaki said. "You are a man of honor, a great fighter. You understand our land. My people need men like you. My daughter." He looked at Winona, and for the first time, Caleb saw the unmistakable love of a father in his eyes. "My daughter has chosen you. Our laws allow for this. You can join our tribe. Become one of us. Your home will be our home. Your people will be our people." Caleb was stunned into silence. He looked at Winona. Her eyes were shining with a hopeful light he had never seen before. She was giving him a choice: stay in his world or join hers. He thought about the life he had known, a life of loss, of loneliness, of being an outsider on a land that was never truly his. Then he looked at Winona. She was his home now, her world, her people. Maybe they could be his too. He was a man who had lost his entire tribe. Maybe it was time to join a new one. He looked at the great chief. "What must I do?" Washaki's stern face broke into a rare, small smile. "First," he said, "you must learn to ride like a Comanche." Caleb looked at Winona and smiled back. It was a new beginning, more incredible than any he could have imagined. He had started as a ghost, a man haunted by the past. But by saving a stranger, he had saved himself. And now he was about to start a new life, not on the edge of a world that didn't want him, but in the very heart of a new one that did. They left the next morning, riding alongside Washaki. As they crested the ridge, Caleb looked back one last time at the small, sagging cabin. It was just a speck on the plains now, a symbol of a life that was finally, truly over. He reached into his pouch and took out the small wooden bird. He handed it to Winona. "So you remember," he said. She took it, her fingers closing over his. "There is nothing to remember, Caleb," she said, her eyes locked on his, "because we will never be apart again." They turned their horses and rode toward the rising sun, leaving the ghosts and the grief behind them, two people from different worlds, forging a new one together. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places, and that a single act of kindness can change not just one life, but the course of history. If you were moved by Caleb and Winona's journey, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We share incredible stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let me know in the comments, what do you think was the biggest turning point for Caleb? Thanks for watching.